December 16, 1944. Early morning in Mona, Germany. The earth was frozen and the air cut like glass. Another wave of American artillery rushed overhead and the sound rolled across the forest like a storm. Something felt different in a way that frightened even veterans. The shells were not tearing into the soil or shattering tree trunks. They were bursting in the air at a measured height above the advancing German lines, and a hard rain of steel fell straight down. No slit trench gave safety. No foxhole or log roof could stop shards that fell from the sky. Men who had survived years on the Eastern Front stared up and realized that the familiar patterns of fire no longer applied. The old rules had been broken and the safe places had vanished. Among the 326th Volk Grenadier Division that pressed the 38th Cavalry Squadron, the shock spread from one file to the next. They expected a rhythm of impacts and lulls. They found no rhythm. They expected to hug the ground and wait it out. They found that the danger came from above. It felt like a new kind of mathematics. It felt like death measured and timed with instruments rather than guesswork. Snow dust rose from the blast waves and drifted over helmets and coats. Splinters hissed through fir branches. The men moved because to stay still felt like asking to be cut down. The line wavered and slowed. At that same hour, Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson of the 406th Artillery Group stood over a map table and made a choice that would shape the day. Orders told him to hold back a secret device. He chose to use it. He told his batteries to load shells fitted with proximity fuses. Each fuse held a small radar set able to sense distance to a target and to detonate at the height that produced the most fragments. He did this without permission from his superiors. He knew the risk to his career and perhaps to his freedom. He also knew that ordinary fire would not stop the assault battering the 38th Cavalry Squadron at Monshaw. He chose to accept blame later and to save the line now. The gunners obeyed and the pattern of bursts shifted at once. The effect arrived like a door opening. Shells that would have buried themselves and wasted power in the ground now exploded where the air met the tree line. Cone after cone of steel swept the open spaces and the edges of the woods. Men who had counted on cover felt the new reach of the blasts. Platoons in motion halted. Runners hugged ditches and crawled. Commands were shouted and lost in the noise. The advance lost speed then lost shape. The change felt like a lever moved by an unseen hand. It felt like arithmetic written in shockwaves. Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson saw the forward observers report a sudden drop in pressure. He knew the decision had worked. Operation Watch on the Rhine had begun under a cover of fog and deception. The Wehrmacht had massed 200,000 men and 1,000 tanks and nearly 2,000 artillery pieces behind the Ardennes in secrecy. The Führer had promised that this stroke would split the Allied front and carry the spearheads to Antwerp. He told his generals that surprise would clear the way and that resolve would finish the task. At 0530 hours on December 16, German guns had achieved perfect surprise along an 85-mile front and fired at a rate of 1,600 rounds per minute. Many American units were composed of replacements still learning the ground. Other units were tired veterans placed in this quiet sector for rest. The first hours went to the attacker. Yet at Monshaw the weight of numbers met the air burst of the new fuse and momentum faltered. Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson understood the cost of acting without orders. He also understood that delay meant collapse. He accepted that a court-martial might follow. He accepted that history would judge a breach and not the consequence of obedience. He ordered the proximity fused shells into steady use. The shells climbed and sensed and detonated. The fragments traced invisible nets across the approaches. The 38th Cavalry Squadron used the precious minutes to realign its defense and to pull back outposts that were about to be swallowed. The men grabbed ammunition. Medics dragged the wounded over ice. Radio traffic grew calm and purposeful. The line held 1 hour longer. Then another. Word moved through the German ranks that this fire was not normal. Men spoke of invisible wires in the air. Men spoke of magic in the fuse noses. What they did not know was the truth of it. Each device carried a tiny transmitter that measured the path to the ground and chose the moment of maximum harm. What had been a single blow against soil became a wide scatter over men and gear. Fragment density spiked. Casualties spiked. Leaders saw squads shrink and companies lose shape. The ambition of the morning now met the cost of science. The storm that had promised to roll westward slowed in the timber and the hollows. The promise of Operation Watch on the Rhine had been built on secrecy and speed. The proximity fuse cut into both. The fog still lay in the valleys. The snow still squeaked under boots and tracks. Yet above the treetops a different kind of fog formed. It was the gray cloud of midair bursts that marked the new zone of danger. The 406th Artillery Group kept the tempo. Forward observers adjusted heights by 10 meters at a time and learned the angles of each draw and ridge. The 326th Volk Grenadier Division pressed and then hesitated. The 38th Cavalry Squadron bent and refused to break. The morning that began with confidence for the Wehrmacht ended with a new understanding. The old calculations of cover and distance and courage had changed. Proximity fuses had multiplied the reach of American guns by a number that men could feel in their bones. Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson looked across the frozen timber and knew that he had changed more than a skirmish. He had shown that a decision at a map table could redraw the very idea of safety in war. The effect did not only stop an attack. It announced a transformation. The mathematics of death had been rewritten in the winter air over Mona, Germany and the frozen Ardennes. German soldiers who advanced in traditional assault formations were suddenly struck by a kind of artillery fire they had never met before. Shells began to burst in the air 30 to 50 feet above the ground instead of tearing into the soil. Each detonation threw a wide cone of steel fragments that swept over a much larger area than a normal ground burst. Veterans who knew how to survive ordinary barrages were cut down in foxholes and behind tree trunks and in roadside ditches. Every place that had once felt safe became a killing ground. What the men felt as a secret science of death was in truth the meeting of American invention and American industry at their highest pitch. The proximity fuse turned that meeting into power on the battlefield. A standard shell needed a direct hit or a timer that often went wrong and burst too high or too low. The new fuse carried its own small radar and chose the height for itself. The complete device was no larger than a coffee can, yet it held a complete radio set that woke in flight and watched the Earth and the target below. American engineers packed about 130 electronic parts into each fuse and they gave it 4 or 5 miniature vacuum tubes depending on the model. Those tiny tubes had to live through a shock of 20,000 times the force of gravity when the gun fired and then had to keep working while the shell spun and crossed cold air and wet air and storm air. At the instant the shell leaped from the barrel, a glass ampoule broke and mixed an electrolyte. That sudden mix created a fresh battery that powered the radar for the rest of the flight. It was hard physics turned into a simple result that any gun crew could use. Dr. Merle Tuve at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory drove the effort with the intensity of the Manhattan Project. The laboratory worked behind a harmless front that looked like an abandoned used car lot in Silver Spring, Maryland. At the peak of the program, the place employed about 3% of all American physicists. Security stood at the level of the atomic program. Workers were not allowed to tell families what they did. Each proximity fuse carried a unique serial number so that any failure could be traced and corrected. Nothing about the job was easy. A vacuum tube built for a living room radio would die at the first shot. Engineers had to reinvent the tube so that it would survive a cannon blast and still pick up the faint signal that marked the ground or a target. The device could not burst too early and it could not sleep through the pass and burst too late. It had to work in snow and in rain and in salt air over the sea. Every demand pushed the technology of the day to its edge. The breakthrough came when the team learned how to miniaturize with methods that would later drive the whole electronics age forward. Dr. James Van Allen and his colleagues produced vacuum tubes no larger than pencil erasers that still held the elements of a full radio tube. With that leap, the proximity fuse moved from a laboratory wonder to a factory product. By December 1944, American plants were turning out about 40,000 fuses every day. More than 100 companies took part, including Radio Corporation of America and General Electric and Sylvania and Crossley Corporation. Assembly lines and inspection lines spread across several states and fed the front at a speed that commanders had never seen. The cost of the program reached $1 billion in 1940s money. Only the Manhattan Project took more in wartime spending. What seemed like a quiet story about wires and glass and solder became a loud change in the field. Shells no longer died in the dirt. They burst in the air where men and machines were most exposed. The result was more than a new tool. It was a turning of the balance that soldiers could feel in their bones and that generals could measure on their maps. Axelson acted on December 16 without waiting for clearance, and the choice set off an immediate crisis in the chain of command. Standing orders had confined proximity fuses to anti-aircraft fire because leaders feared a dud might be recovered by German technicians and copied. At Mona, the payoff was too plain to deny. The assault stalled and losses mounted in minutes, and veteran officers on both sides were shaken by the result. Reports moved from battery to regiment and then to Supreme Headquarters through field telephones and secure radio nets. General Eisenhower judged that the situation across the Ardennes demanded more than caution. On December 19 he asked for authority to free the new fuse for ground combat. On December 21 the prohibition ended and every artillery headquarters in the Bulge was told to draw and fire proximity fused stocks. The speed that followed displayed American logistics at full reach. Ammunition trains and truck convoys pushed forward through snow and clogged roads, and within days cases of the new round sat beside gun pits from north to south across the forested hills. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion at Bastonia received its allotment as the German ring closed and the last usable roads were cut. The 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion with its M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers began to beat back thrusts on the northwest approaches and registered new defensive lines under pressure. The 969th Artillery Battalion, an African-American unit under Lieutenant Colonel Hubert D. Barnes, put the rounds to work southwest of Bastonia where villages and tree lines funneled attacks. Gunners learned the method in a single-fire mission. Load. Set elevation. Fire. Let the fuse choose the height of burst. Forward observers no longer had to walk rounds onto a trench or hedge. The shell found the air above the target and broke there, and steel swept out in a hard flat fan that punished movement and punished shelter. Accuracy requirements eased while destructive power rose, and the effect was that artillery ceased to be a silent partner and became a deciding arm on its own. Bastonia, surrounded but superior, became the textbook case. The 101st Airborne Division held the crossroads, though outnumbered and short of sleep and fuel. Their artillery group included the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion with 75 mm pack howitzers that could lob proximity-fused shells over woods and into concealed draws. From December 19 through December 31, the 463rd fired exactly 7,676 rounds according to the unit record. Shortages meant that only a portion carried the new nose, but each air burst tore at nerve and body alike. German assault lines that had trusted ground cover withered under patterns of mid-air detonations, and whole platoons vanished in seconds when bursts rolled down a white field. On December 22, after General McAuliffe gave his famous nuts reply to the surrender demand, the next German push met that pattern in the open. Snow glare showed every file and every shadow, and the fuses opened above them at the altitude that produced the most fragments. The attack faltered. The observers called for repeat. The line held. The day ended with proof that a device no larger than a coffee tin could alter a battle when industry and delivery put it in the hands of trained crews. Proximity-fused shells burst in the air at calculated heights and intervals that overlapped into a continuous curtain of fragments and shock. There were no gaps where a soldier could feel safe. The All-African Amin 969th Artillery Battalion proved decisive in the same period. Their 155 mm howitzers laid down a continuous belt of fire around the perimeter of Bastogne that German units could not break. The largest rounds were set to explode near 50 feet above the ground, and the spread of steel reached far beyond normal craters. German prisoners later described assaults that fell apart before contact with American lines because the sudden air bursts shattered cohesion and nerve. The Sauer River slaughter became the most closely recorded example of what the proximity fuse could do in battle. It unfolded at the Sauer River near Echton on December 25 and December 26. General George S. Patton and his Third Army were driving north to relieve Bastonia, and he watched the action himself and later noted it in War as I Knew It. A German battalion chose to cross the river while it was partly frozen and believed darkness and fog would hide movement from American eyes. Conventional gunnery would have demanded long adjustment and bracketing, which would have granted the Germans precious minutes to reach the far bank or to take cover. Proximity-fused ammunition erased that delay and removed the guesswork. Patton wrote that his forces caught a German battalion on the Sauer and that the new posit ammunition broke them in the open with air bursts detonating overhead. There was no place to go with the river behind and the fire in front and above. When the guns fell silent, American troops counted 702 bodies. The count was exact and remains one of the rare confirmed casualty totals tied to proximity fuse employment. The efficiency read like an equation without emotion. In only a few minutes a battalion ceased to function with no chance to escape and no effective defense. The shock spread quickly across the local front. German soldiers in nearby formations began to refuse fresh river crossings, and small unit leaders struggled to push patrols beyond the banks. Forest warfare changed as well. The dense growth of the Ardennes became a trap once proximity fuses arrived. In open ground a burst at 30 to 50 feet already killed or wounded across a broad area. In the woods the effect multiplied many times. The shells ripped branches into jagged splinters and hurled them downward and outward like a storm of wooden darts. Some splinters were as long as a man's arm and they flew at hundreds of feet per second with deadly force. Old habits failed. Taking cover behind wide trunks did not help. Foxholes dug into root webs did not help. Fragments and splinters rained from above and negated generations of fieldcraft about how to fight under trees. American artillerymen noticed the multiplier almost at once and adjusted procedures to use it again and again. Forward observers learned to call for air bursts just inside the canopy rather than at ground impact. Gun crews refined the timing of fuses to keep the pattern thick and continuous across assembly areas and likely routes. The result was tactical paralysis among attackers and a rapid erosion of morale. Movement slowed. Orders to advance across open patches or to enter the forest at night drew hesitation. Even when the firing ended, the psychological echo lingered, and that echo protected Bastogne and the relief effort for Bastonia. A single proximity-fused 155mm shell that bursts above the forest roof can wipe clean a space as large as a tennis court. Metal shards from the casing and ragged wooden splinters torn from the trees spread outward in every direction and create a circle of death that no training can beat. German soldiers who had learned to fight among trees discovered that their knowledge failed. When they spread out to limit losses, the wide area effect still found them. When they closed ranks to help one another, a single burst could erase an entire squad. There was no correct move against this new danger. It was technical superiority made visible. The proximity fuse worked with principles that looked like magic to soldiers of the 1940s. Inside each small metal head sat a tiny radio set that operated between 180 and 220 MHz. It sent a steady stream of waves that bounced back from the ground and from trunks and from vehicles and from bodies. As the shell drew nearer, the echo grew stronger. When the echo reached the level tied to the best height for damage, an electronic switch fired the charge. All of this had to keep working under violence that ruined normal equipment. The shell left the gun with a shock that reached 20,000 times the gravity of Earth. Barrels heated the skin to thousands of degrees Fahrenheit and the flight climbed into air that froze breath. The spin of the projectile created brutal outward force. Yet careful protection of delicate vacuum tubes kept the device alive and the system reached reliability above 80%. Tests fixed the best burst heights for different guns and calibers. At Aberdeen Proving Ground the standard 105mm howitzer showed that 30 feet above the surface gave ideal coverage. The 155mm weapons reached peak effect at 50 feet. The rare 240mm shells produced terror at 70 feet and beyond, and they could strip entire grid squares of defenders. This edge in design turned into control of the field. Studies measured gains from 5 times to 10 times in killing power when compared with normal shells. The area where fragments could kill grew by a factor of 50. Results against aircraft looked even more dramatic. Crews that fought V-1 flying bombs improved interception from 17% to 79% within weeks after proximity fuses entered service. German intelligence and leadership failed to read the danger. In December 1944, Wehrmacht forces captured an American ammunition site and took roughly 20,000 shells with proximity fuses. That haul should have forced a rush to build answers. Instead, German specialists looked at the captured parts and judged that the device could not work as described. They wasted the moment and they paid for it in blood. The forest became a trap. A burst set for 30 to 50 feet already caused terrible wounds in an open field. Under heavy branches the power multiplied many times. Splinters as long as a forearm fell like a storm of spears, and they moved at hundreds of feet per second. Old habits died. Thick trunks did not save men. Foxholes dug among roots did not save men. Death fell from above and erased rules that had guided fighters for generations. Forward observers learned fast and began to request bursts just beneath the canopy rather than on impact with the soil. Gun crews tuned the timing to keep the sky filled with overlapping patterns. Attackers halted. Orders to enter a stand of trees at night drew silence and slow steps. Even after the batteries stopped, the ringing in the mine stayed, and that echo shaped each new choice on the line. German engineers could not accept that an artillery shell might carry fragile vacuum tubes and still survive firing in flight. The idea violated their trained sense of what electronics and ballistics could endure. Many concluded that the Americans must be using some kind of magnetic trick, or that the visible parts were decoys that hid the real working core. This misreading grew from institutional habits and from choices made before the war. Germany had in fact led work on the proximity fuse in the early period. Rheinmetall Borsig and AEG Berlin had functioning test pieces by the year 1940. Then Hitler ordered the cancellation of any weapons effort that needed more than 6 months to reach production, and the line went dead. The same specialists who stopped the program could not imagine that the Americans had forced solutions to problems they themselves had set aside. The disbelief fed on its own momentum and blinded decision-makers who should have known better. The irony grows sharper when the record of German laboratories is set beside the battlefield. Their electrostatic proximity fuses had shown 95% reliability during trials that measured shifts in electrical capacitance rather than radar signals. If the work had continued without interruption, Germany might have placed proximity fuses in the field by 1941. Hermann Göring later told interrogators that German fuses stood 3 or 4 months from mass production when the fighting ended. The meaning is clear. A path existed. It was not pursued. The loss was not only technical. It was strategic. A single decision cut off a line of invention that could have reshaped entire campaigns in the early years of the conflict. The Christmas catastrophe followed as a grim lesson written in fire. December 25, 1944 brought no rest and no armistice. German formations that tried to use the holiday for resupply and for reorganization learned that proximity fuses honored no pause in battle. Field kitchens drew fire. Supply convoys drew fire. Assembly points drew fire. The rounds found them without the help of forward observers. The 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion alone sent more than 1,000 shells on Christmas Day, and most of these rounds carried proximity fuses. Their M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers produced quick and steady fire and struck with a speed that left German units unready and exposed. What had once been a daylight arm became a threat that worked through cloud and into night and did not depend on clear sight lines or on visual correction. The mental shock spread fast because the old shelter rules collapsed at once. German soldiers had learned to move when weather turned foul and when Allied aircraft could not fly and when observers could not see. They trusted fog and rain and snow. Proximity fuses erased that safe window. Death could fall at any hour in any weather without more warning than the thin whistle of shells coming in from far away. The habit of choosing poor weather to reduce risk became a habit that no longer worked. Men began to hesitate. The simple act of stepping off a track or lighting a stove became a risk because the sky itself had become the trigger. Malmi and Scorzini's elite were struck by this new reality as well. On December 21, SS Colonel Otto Scorzini led his chosen commandos in an attempt to seize Malmedy. These were not ordinary troops. They had rescued Mussolini. They had nearly captured Tito. They had crossed American lines while wearing American uniforms. They represented the sharpest edge that Germany could place in the field. They met proximity-fused artillery that burst above them with a precision that seemed to read their movement and turned their American disguise from a clever tool into a dangerous burden. Exact counts remain debated, but the outcome is not. The attack failed with heavy losses and Scorsese's offensive operations came to an end. The collapse of confidence inside elite formations carried special weight, and it marked the moment when belief in old methods gave way to fear of a device that changed the rules of battle. These soldiers were raised on certainty about German superiority and trained to the highest standards, yet they stood powerless before American technology. Unit cohesion failed under the storm of air bursts and fragments. Eyewitnesses described men who abandoned cover and ran straight toward American lines because a swift end felt easier than waiting for the next strike. That impulse marked a collapse of discipline inside formations that Hitler considered the most loyal and the most resolute. The belief system that had carried them through earlier campaigns met a weapon that did not respect courage or drill, and the result was despair that moved from squad to squad like a cold wind. Behind that effect stood an industrial feat that matched any achievement of the war. By December 1944, more than 100 American companies had shifted entirely to fuse work. The Crosley Corporation left refrigerators for assembly benches. Emerson Radio retooled from household sets to military components. Sylvania RCA and General Electric turned whole plants into dedicated lines. Quality control reached a standard not seen before in mass production. Every one of the 130 parts faced its own test. Each solder joint was checked under magnification. Random lots were fired from guns to prove survival in flight and recoil. The reject bin never stayed empty because even a small deviation meant discard without appeal. A workforce made up largely of women held this precision for 12-hour shifts 6 days each week. Security rules kept them from knowing the full purpose of their labor. They understood only that it was vital and urgent and that the schedule allowed no pause. Output rose until a proximity fuse left the line every 2 seconds around the clock. The price fell across the same period. In 1942, a single unit cost $732, which was more than a typical annual wage. By the last month of 1944, the unit price stood near $18 while reliability stayed high. The scale of delivery changed the battlefield. Factories produced 22 million fuses during the war and 200,000 went forward for the Battle of the Bulge alone. Numbers like these meant that commanders could plan entire operations around air bursts rather than save a few precious rounds for rare targets. The weapon moved from experiment to routine, and routine is what wins campaigns. General George S. Patton grasped the arithmetic faster than most. His Third Army drove to relieve Bastonia and treated the new fuse as a tool for breakthrough. His artillery chief Brigadier General Edward Williams wrote tactics to fit the device rather than forcing the device into old patterns. Williams refined time on target so that many battalions fired in a way that brought shells together over the same grid at the same second. Dozens of proximity-fused rounds detonated at proper height and created a ceiling of steel that no formation could cross. German veterans called that sound the bell toll of death, and the name stayed. During the week from December 22 to December 29, Patton's guns sent 50,000 proximity-fused shells. The result was the opening of the corridor toward Bastonia and the quick erosion of German resistance. Patton later wrote that the funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us and no one near the front argued with that judgment. Elsinborn Ridge provided the clearest stage for maximum effect. The 2nd and the 99th Infantry Divisions held ground that controlled movement for miles. Across the snow and the bare trees came the 6th SS Panzer Army with the elite 1st SS Panzer Division Luftstandarte Adolf Hitler. Air bursts met their approach and stripped the cover from tree lanes and hedgerows. The ridge did not fall. The forward edge stayed in American hands because artillery reached into every draw and every road and broke attacks before they formed. Across 3 days from December 17 through December 19, American batteries loosed 160,000 shells and roughly 40,000 of those carried proximity fuses. That quarter of the total created close to 60% of the more than 5,000 German casualties. The ratio could not be argued. The new fuse turned every gun into 4 guns in practical effect. Assault groups that tried to climb the steep forested approaches met layered curtains of air-burst steel. Whole companies vanished in moments and the ground filled so quickly with the fallen that the next waves had to clamber over the bodies of their own comrades. After 3 days the hammering stopped, the frontal pushes ended and the elite of the Waffen-SS found themselves broken by American technology that they could not outfight. Operation Bodenplatte followed and laid bare the same truth. On January 1, 1945 the Luftwaffe sent 900 fighters against Allied airfields and achieved complete surprise with many aircraft still on the ground. Yet the return flight home became a passage through layered proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. Of the 277 German aircraft lost that day, 172 fell to anti-aircraft guns, most using proximity fuses. Crews trained to slip predictive fire suddenly faced shells that burst at the exact height where fragments would do the most harm. The Luftwaffe, which had already been crippled by losses and fuel shortage, did not recover from the blow delivered in a single winter morning. Secrecy could not hold under that volume of use. By early January 1945 too many units had received the ammunition and too many soldiers had seen what it did in fog, cloud and snow. On January 6 the War Department approved a limited public description. The New York Times reported a new kind of artillery shell that multiplies the power of American guns but did not reveal the method. 4 days later German intelligence finally recognized the scale of the danger. A January 10 paper from Foreign Armies West concluded that the Americans possess a radio-controlled artillery fuse that detonates at the best height for anti-personnel effect and that no countermeasures existed for the errands. Post-war assessments fixed the meaning in clear terms. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt stated that the proximity fuse was decisive and that attacks failed not only because of American courage but because of artillery that seemed to carry eyes. General Asso Montoya, who commanded the 5th Panzer Army, testified that American artillery terrified his soldiers and that the shells that burst in the air created panic even among veterans. The numbers matched those judgments. 200,000 proximity-fused shells were fired and they accounted for an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 German casualties, which was as much as 1/5 of total German losses. In trials and in battle the new fuse delivered between 5 and 10 times the effectiveness of ordinary ammunition, and it often did so without the help of forward observers in poor weather. The figures hide people and the people carry pain that cannot be counted. Behind each entry in a ledger stood a German infantryman or gunner or messenger, many of them boys taken into uniform during the last months of the Reich. They died in ways their teachers and manuals had never imagined. They were cut down by shells that sensed the world around them and chose their moment to burst so that no fold in the ground and no clump of trees offered safety. On the other side of the ocean, American workers in places like Crosley Corporation and Emerson Radio paid in their own coin. Security rules concealed the purpose of their tasks. Accidents were folded into silence. Fatigue and worry followed them home after long shifts. They assembled devices of unfamiliar power while knowing only that delay meant more dead at the front and that the clock did not forgive mistakes. The arithmetic of war never becomes clean. The Battle of the Bulge took the lives of 19,000 Americans and wounded or captured many more. Had the proximity fuse not existed, how many families would have received telegrams and how many months would have been added to a war already swollen with grief? Each day of delay would have meant more trains heading to camps and more lives lost before Allied soldiers could open the gates. The questions are cold, but they carry weight in any honest account of the winter of 1944 and 1945. The device that made shells burst at the best height shortened fights on countless fields, and the shortening of fights saved lives that would otherwise have vanished without a trace. The program that built the fuse changed the future as much as it shaped the present. The small vacuum tubes designed to survive launch recoil heat and cold became a seedbed for later electronics. Methods created to check every part and every joint set models for quality control that factories used long after the war ended. The web that tied together hundreds of suppliers and rushed parts to assembly lines wrote early chapters in modern supply chain management. Out of that same effort came talent that moved beyond artillery. Dr. James Van Allen carried his experience with miniaturization into the age of satellites, and his instruments helped reveal the belts of radiation that encircle Earth. Radar practice refined for the fuse evolved into systems that watched the sky and the sea in peacetime and in war. The deeper idea mattered most. Engineers taught ammunition to read its surroundings and to act without further human touch. That concept of a sensor that makes a choice became the base for guided missiles and later for every form of precision-guided weapon. From anti-aircraft batteries to modern smart artillery and bombs, the family tree points back to the winter fields where the first shells listened for their own echo and then shattered the air at the perfect height. What began as a hard fix to a battlefield problem became a philosophy of design that reshaped combat across generations. The battle itself reached its end on January 25, 1945. German forces that had surged westward fell back in disorder. Hitler's last throw had spent men, fuel and aircraft and had gained nothing that could be held. German losses reached roughly 100,000 and American losses climbed to about 75,000 with 19,000 killed. In the judgments written soon after and in the histories that followed, the proximity fuse stood out as a war winner rather than a clever accessory. General Eisenhower warned that if Germany had possessed similar fuses, the landings on D-Day might have been exceedingly difficult and perhaps impossible, and that assessment underlines the scale of what was at stake. For the soldiers on the receiving end, there was a sense that the very air had turned hostile. They told of shells that seemed to think and to find them anywhere, and of moments when tree lanes and road cuts turned into killing grounds without visible gunners or observed corrections. Their memories marked the turning of warfare into something governed by sensors and circuits as much as by muscle and courage. The Ardennes became the place where that turn first became visible to thousands, and where the lesson entered doctrine, plans and factories that would define the decades ahead. The legacy does not rest only in museums or in pages of reports. It lives in the expectation that a weapon will measure and decide and strike with economy. It lives in manufacturing floors that still follow inspection steps born in secrecy. It lives in the idea that speed and precision can spare friendly lives and shorten wars even as they make destruction more exact. The proximity fuse was a hinge on which both outcomes swing. It reduced the time between contact and decision on the battlefield, and it compressed the time between idea and effect in the workshop, and that compression has become a hallmark of the technological age. In the end, the story holds grief, achievement, fear and relief together. Teenagers in Feldgrau crumpled under air bursts that no trench could stop. Women and men at soldering benches pushed through exhaustion and did not know why until the papers finally printed a guarded description. Commanders counted losses and gains and found that a small device carried the weight of entire operations. The winter campaign closed the door on the last German offensive and opened another onto a world where weapons sense and act, and where victory often belongs to those who best align science with production and doctrine. On December 16, 1944, Colonel Axelson carried out the first unauthorized use of the proximity fuse. What began as a single field decision turned into a deliberate rollout of roughly 200,000 shells across the Ardennes. The new fuse proved in real combat that science applied with urgency could deliver a decisive edge. American factories, research teams and artillery units moved in step and turned a fresh idea into a battlefield habit. That alignment of industrial capacity, scientific problem solving and quick tactical learning forged a tool that pressed the war in a new direction. The story of the proximity fuse is a story of change on many levels. It is technological because tiny radar sets could now guide destruction in the air above the target. It is tactical because commanders altered fire missions and timing to exploit air bursts. It is human because soldiers on both sides felt its effects and adjusted their behavior with fear and respect. The experience showed that an industrial democracy could build weapons of severe effectiveness without losing speed or scale. It also showed that innovation could offset fewer guns or men and that the side with stronger science would usually gain the initiative and hold it. These lessons influenced the closing phases of World War II and then continued to shape doctrine procurement and training for decades. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, a threshold was crossed and modern technological warfare came fully into view. The arithmetic of killing changed when small radar devices rode inside artillery shells and detonated at the right height. From that point forward, the method of waging war changed in practice and in mindset. German soldiers killed under proximity fused air bursts fell not only to a single engagement but to a wider revolution in military affairs that still reaches into our present world today.